Okay, well, first of all, thank you for attending today. I'm excited to share my work with you. The working title for my dissertation is Training Citizen Scientists, a Qualitative Comparative Multiple Case Study to Identify Theoretical and Instructional Design Themes in Current Citizen Science Training Initiatives. So when I read books to my kids, I say page when it's time to change the page. So I will say slide, and then you can just advance your slide. There's lots of slides, but I only intend to be on each one for about 20 or 30 seconds. So here we go. Slide. All right, so citizen scientists are volunteers who participate in scientific activities under the guidance of professional scientists and organizations. One of the first and longest running citizen science projects involves measuring the day plants emerge in the spring, 100 years, all going back to my heritage in Massachusetts at Walden Pond. So this dissertation inquiry investigates citizen science training and its perceived effectiveness. The general problem is data collected by citizen scientists is often viewed as unreliable by the professional scientists and land managers who might use it, which results in lower confidence in scientific use of citizen scientist collected data. The specific problem is the absence of educational training measurement in citizen science program design and analysis with which to ascertain the learning gains of trained citizen scientists. So what I hope to do here with the qualitative comparative multiple case study is to identify patterns and themes in programs that already exist in the content, instructional design, theoretical alignment, and perceived efficacy of training, specifically for citizen scientists tasked with collecting ecological data in the field. There are many kinds of citizen science projects, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So citizen scientists are increasingly important to the implementation and assessment of ecological restoration, species identification, ecological monitoring, and myriad other disciplines and concepts. In my professional life, for example, I have a master's degree in biology. I don't get paid ever to collect data. But in the last 10 years, I've worked with volunteers who I've trained to do the work that I was trained to do. And that was just the nature of the funding schema in the last decade. And there's no change in that. We're not getting more funds to protect our landscapes and to monitor our oceans, skies, etc. So in my dissertation, I'll employ certain terms to the educational discipline and to the specific field of citizen science. So andragogy is the art and science of helping adults learn, juxtaposed to pedagogy, which most people are much more familiar with. Backwards design is a principle of instructional design in which you first decide what you want your students to learn, and then you decide how you will assess them, and then you finally decide how you're going to engage them in their learning activities. And then citizen science itself, there are several definitions. I'm going to use the Cornell Lab definition because this is really one of the seminal labs in citizen science. In North America, citizen science typically refers to research collaborations between scientists and volunteers, particularly but not exclusively to expand opportunities for scientific data collection and to provide access to scientific information for community members. I'm sorry, I haven't been telling you to advance the slides. I apologize.
That's okay. We're all good. I'm following along as well. We're following along. It's fine.
I just stopped to take a drink and realized that. So, slide 7. Citizen scientists. They're volunteers who participate in scientific activities under the guidance of professional scientists. Now, I want to stop for a moment and note that the definition is actually different in the United States and in Europe. For example, the European government specifically says volunteers, but not the United States government when they write about citizen scientists. So when the government writes about citizen science, it talks about informal science education, ISE. This is the term they used in their first solicitation that funded the first citizen science research initiatives in 2009. And then citizen science literacy is the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. It also includes specific types of abilities, excuse me. This is important to our culture at large because the science literacy of American citizens is declining. Slide 8. The literature currently focuses on 3 components of citizen science. So as we were just talking about, the science literacy gains for volunteers. The original funding solicitation really was driven by this cultural need to engage citizens in scientific activities outside of the classroom to improve our literacy as a culture and a citizenry. And then the second stream is the credibility of data collected by citizen scientists. This is of my primary concern. And then, of course, if we're going to use volunteers to do the work of scientists, we want to know if it costs more money or less money for the gains. So the usefulness and economic benefits are also important. Slide 9. So citizen science literature, it's a really pretty small literature base. Now, I didn't do that just to get out of work. I just really have grown up in this culture, honestly. So I got out of grad school in 2006, the first time. And the funding solicitation came out in 2009. And what we can see here is that the literature follows this funding trend and this research trend. But it's not old, right? So the very first time the term was used, it wasn't even really talking about anything we're talking about. It's talking about social ecology. So anyway, I will just briefly say that if you query ProQuest, for citizen science, you get 553 articles since 1997. So really not very many. And if you ask for citizen science and training, you only get 30 articles in ProQuest, 26 in EBSCO, 13 in ProQuest dissertations, and 2 in Citizen Science Theory and Practice, a brand new journal. So this is about 5% of the literature. So among the 553 articles on slide 10, we see that there are numerous demographics for citizen science. So it engages indigenous human populations, college students, students of all ages, private landowners, nonprofit groups all over the world. And it occurs in forests, gardens, oceans, rivers, the sky, and from within one's own home or office with the use of computer accessible cloud-based data. And there's just really myriad opportunities for engagement. So when trying to do research on something that is this new, one of the challenges is really dialing down on the proper language. So I made this word cloud, so 21st century of me, or millennial of me. So here we go. These are all the words in the literature to describe citizen science. And they come with various implied meanings and values. So these terms are community science, volunteer biological monitoring, participatory monitoring, community-based monitoring. And really, when the National Science Foundation Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, CASE, sponsored their first inquiry group, that was the first time that citizen science became a word that we coalesce around, especially when we're talking about ecological data collection initiatives. Slide 11. So as I mentioned, 5% of the citizen science literature references training, like even uses the word. And over 150 scholarly documents were analyzed for this literature review. So, it's really bringing a lot of sub-disciplines into it. The journal Citizen Science Theory and Practice came out since I became a student at the University of the Rockies. And the first issue was published in 2016. I've cited 6 articles here, and hopefully I'll publish part of this dissertation in this journal. And then this journal has a slightly better focus on training. If you do the math, about 10% of the articles are about training. Okay, so let's get to this science literacy piece. Since I am a professional scientist, I really didn't even think about this when I first approached the literature. But citizen science projects are really started for the sole purpose of enhancing literacy, but you can see that the funding source was kind of in that direction. Now we look at this schematic here. There are many ways that ordinary citizens can be engaged in scientific research. So they can go out for looking at the bottom of the triangle, and also for us educators, this is really analogous to Bloom's taxonomy. So at the bottom of the triangle, we go out for half a day. We have a very simple task, and usually lots of volunteers, and they go out and do it. Okay, and then we go up, and then sometimes we develop programs where, for example, citizens are concerned about their environment, for example, water quality, like Flint, Michigan. And they're contributing because they care, but as we go up, they're actually creating the science. They're designing the research questions, they're designing the methodology, and they're analyzing it and taking it all the way through the scientific process. So their science literacy is affected by how engaged they are. So slide 13. Another stream in the literature, data quality, is huge. Citizen science has the potential to increase the scale of data collection, but we just don't understand this data reliability very well because we don't do research on it. So discussions of data quality are numerous, but these are often studies where you just go out and you create a simulated environment of data collection where a professional scientist and citizen scientists, or you have a benchmark measurement, they collect analogous measurements, and you see, did the citizen scientists do as well as the professional scientists? So you can see that there's a slight problem here. Slide 14. We need to know what we did to train these citizen scientists to understand why they do a good job. If we haven't explained the process as educators, then the expectation that they would do as good a job as us, since we've been in school for decades, is just really something we need to figure out. And so there's starting to be more and more literature describing this, especially in the conclusion that any training is valuable. We need to study this more. Slide 15. So all studies that do address training do so in one of 2 ways. They report a simple fact, like we trained them, and here's what we found from the data they collected. Alternatively, training is the premise of the research, which is what I'm doing here. There are very few studies with this in mind. So essentially, I asked Dr. Newman to join my committee as the external committee member because his work since his dissertation in 2010 really has paved the way for the work that I hope to do. And working with another person, Alicia Kroll in Wisconsin, they designed this amazing training research program. No brown nosing, but it was quite amazing. There were 2 cohorts of trainees, one in Wisconsin, one in Colorado, and they went through a simulated training experience, and was benchmarked by professional scientists. And let's move to training slide 16. We found that citizen science are proficient at collecting simple data, and lots of papers report this. But their data quality decreases when the data collection challenge increases. And they struggle with procedural and GPS skills, so just the how-to of science. And then they perform equally well with live or video training, and better than static documents alone. And I forgot to add the bullet, not as well as professional scientists. And then Starr et al., this was the next dissertation, found that citizen scientists, again in a contrived experimental setting for training, performed equally well with live or video training and better than statistic documents alone. So I stop here because those particular conclusions are very important to the methodology of my dissertation. Slide 17. The purpose of this research design is to identify the patterns and themes in content instructional design, theoretical alignment, and perceived efficacy of training for citizen scientist volunteers tasked with collecting data in the field. Slide 18. So there are some, the theoretical framework for this is based on a couple of assumptions. So that the acquisition of procedural knowledge is possible in a training setting outside of academia where scientists are formally trained. And then, of course, that education contributes to learning. And then finally, I come back to these terms, andragogy and backwards design, because these are principles that are successful in other training contexts and higher education. So my research questions, slide 19, are what are the characteristics of citizen science trainings designed to train volunteers to collect ecological data in natural land settings? And how do organizational leaders describe their perception of the efficacy of the trainings to produce reliable data collection? Slide 20. A multiple case study design is appropriate because it affords a breadth of information from which themes can be extrapolated. This design is exploratory in nature, but you know, we have a little bit of quantitative backgrounds on our committee. The sequential investigative steps drive at that descriptive case study design, hoping to have a lot of robust data. Slide 21. The qualitative case study design is important because no observational study exists. So there's no a priori research other than the Starr, Kroll, and Newman research I described. And this methodology involves the collection of both text-based and numeric data and puts it into one analytical tool. And then in a sequential investigation, first I'll identify the cases, then I will analyze the static documents, then I will survey the organizational leaders, and finally conduct a follow-up semi-structured interview to triangulate those earlier steps. Participant sample. Oh no, a slide with no number. The purposive sample for this will include the organizational users of the citsci.org database. This is a database, it's on the web, and it really is quite amazing. You can communicate with your volunteers, train them, collect data, design data collection forms, analyze the data, visualize it, and it's all free and it's all in one place. So nonprofits and other organizations without a lot of money can still access high quality science tools. And the 400 organizational users will compose the purposive sample. So slide 22. So in this schematic, we just see how in qualitative research, we're constantly feeding into the case study database and analyzing at the same time. So first I will identify the cases, and as I collect the documents, I will be modifying the survey, you know, if I see some trends that I didn't predict from reading the literature. And then after I have completed the document analysis and firmed up some codes, I will use the survey to query the entire database or the entire purposive sample. And then finally, the interviews with the training leaders. It's really the same survey questions with sub-questions to really confirm that information that I've already collected. And at each step, this information will be put into the case study database, and I'll be able to analyze it as I go along the way. Slide 23. So as I mentioned before, we're really assuming here that studying this is a valuable concept because procedural knowledge could be acquired in a training environment, and that we could train or we could teach citizen scientists what we know in our educational experiences that we design. Slide 24. And I'm assuming that the citsci.org database contains a representative sample. And I'm making this assumption because it's really driven towards that ecological data collection. And then I'm assuming that I'm going to be able to see these themes and codes when I look at the documents. And then finally, that I can produce valuable information without attending any trainings and observing them. Slide 25. And I'm going to assume that principles of teaching adults are going to be effective. We're going to see that they're effective when we analyze these training and documents. And that if there seems to be some intentional process to the training, that it will contribute to an accountable and intentional educational experience. Slide 26. So the flip side of the coin, I will only look at users of the citsci database, and I only care about citizen science projects involving adults. And finally, that I really only want to look at projects where volunteers are collecting ecological data. Slide 27. So again, relating to the sample, this is a limitation. There would be no other sample to query other than the SciStarter database, but that's much larger and is extremely expansive in the disciplines that it engages. And then finally, I'm not going to attend the trainings. Slide 28. The goal here is that I'm going to analyze 30 to 50 cases. If more than 100 organizations meet the criteria, I might have to limit that. And the current thought is that we would limit it by plant identification projects specifically. And this is a sample I feel confident about achieving because a couple of years ago in an undergraduate research project sent out a survey and over 100 people responded, organizations responded. Slide 28. So as I mentioned, I'll be constantly analyzing this data, and I will be using the Deduce software program to do this. Slide 30. So getting back to this concept of why do a sequential design. So by collecting multiple streams of analogous data, I'm really establishing data quality. I'm contributing to data credibility. Can I confirm it with repetition? Can I transfer it to other organizations? If someone else tried to do my research, would they find the same things? And finally, are my themes and codes going to adequately represent the organizations and training programs that exist on the ground? So by doing a sequential design, I can do my best to triangulate these data. Slide 31. My sample is individuals, not organizations, so I don't assume that there are ethical concerns here. And at no time am I collecting any personal information about the participants in any of these programs. Slide 31. So as we described at the beginning, the scholarly information about citizen science training is limited just to single organization case studies and training simulations. And this will be the first attempt to aggregate this information. And I really hope to reveal these similarities and differences. Slide 32. So I've described to you my qualitative comparative multiple case study design, my purposive sample of citsci.org database, the sequential design will include 4 steps: case identification, training, or excuse me, document analysis, surveys, semi-structured interviews. I'll use the Deduce software to do this, and through my analysis, this will contribute to triangulation. And hopefully the cross-case analysis will reveal important themes and trends in the demographics and program details, and inform future citizen science training initiatives and data collection reliability. Thank you very much. The following slides are my references.
Fantastic.
Very nicely done.
Maggie. Yeah, thank you.
Do either of you have any questions for Maggie?
I don't. I thought that was very well done, very well organized. The only thing better than that was reading the actual paper itself. A very nice presentation.
Yeah, very clear, Maggie. Well written, well articulated, well researched, good coverage of the literature. I do have one question regarding the intent to study the perceptions of the training by the leaders of, the organizational leaders doing the trainings. And I'm wondering, this obviously sets up some future work, but I'm wondering to what degree you've thought of getting beyond the perceptions of the efficacy of the training. So a characterization of the training approaches is desperately needed. And I am very excited that this will uncover through these methods that characterization, kind of get a landscape of how these types of trainings are occurring, etc. And then looking at the degree to which the leaders feel that they were successful in training their volunteers is also desperately needed. I'm wondering about that last extension, the natural next step, and what your thoughts are about it as far as, okay, how can we take a look at the design of instructional trainings for citizen scientists and their theoretical approaches and framings, and say to what degree are they meeting the learning objectives, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. And I will, I keep telling Kim, I'm like, I'll do that in the postdoc. Because
it makes it ripe for future work, is I guess my perspective. But yeah.
Well, but
absolutely.
To answer your question, like I've done this before. When I did my ecological research, I did a regression tree analysis, and so the data might in the case study database, it might facilitate that kind of analysis, even though I'm assuming it doesn't, because in order for us to analyze more than the perception, the organization would have had to plan to assess before doing it. So perhaps we will end up with a level in the treatment that is the organizations that plan to assess. So like in my ecological data, there was only one land manager who did any active revegetation. So unfortunately, he did not make up his own level. And I wasn't able to compare that. But maybe we'll find that. That would be very exciting if we did.
Yeah. I'm wondering too, and this is just my brainstorming, if there's a way to look at surrogates for learning evaluation, right? I mean, so it's very possible that many of these case studies identified might not have done formal evaluation, kind of AKA Tina Phillips, with a program evaluation kind of approach in citizen science. And that's okay, because that's the nature of this type of social mixed methods research, really, this approach. And so, but maybe there's other surrogate metrics for, the learning that occurred in the adult volunteers in the programs identified. So, for example, you could look at the other metrics of the degree to which the data are being used by the agencies involved in the collaboration. You could look at the degree to which volunteers continue to submit data, and you could even, I suppose, look at whether that program has like a QA/QC protocol for like quality assurance of the data being gathered by volunteers. Some of your case studies might have those, some might not, for example. And in that way, you're getting surrogates for the impacts of the training. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but that's
No, you are, because when we met before, we talked about, so I triplicated several of the survey questions so that there was a Likert scale and then a bimodal response. And so maybe through the Likert scale questions, we can do that kind of analysis, because I do have some questions in there about, do you still use the data? Was it published? Are you, these kinds of things.
Right.
So.
Perfect. That does make sense, and that seems possible. Cool. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. If nobody else has any other questions for Maggie, Maggie, you did a great job. If you could hang up, and I'll call you in a little while.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.